So, hi everyone, my name is Louise, and as I was so nicely presented, I'm an aerospace engineer. I'm from Sweden, but I've been living in Portugal for the past 3 years, where I'm responsible for the attitude control system of a satellite, which we are building in my company called TEDxIST in Lisbon. And for the past 2 years, I've also, with some friends, started a company where we are building a software to try to revolutionize the way that big companies do engineering collaboration. And you can say that these two companies that I'm working for are part of this new space revolution that is happening. So today I'm going to tell you a bit about what the new space is, and also maybe you're wondering, if there is a new space, there should also be an old space. So I'm going to tell us what the old space is and some differences between them, and also specifically 5 ways that the space industry is changing today. So, what is the old space? You all know what NASA is, right? You can say that the old space started somewhere in the years that NASA was created, which was in 1958. During this time, the United States and the Soviet Union were in the middle of a Cold War, which was basically, it was like a contest over who had the best ideologies of the US and the Soviet Union. And 1 year before NASA was created, in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first ever artificial satellites that orbited Earth. And this was, of course, a big defeat for the US. It was a big crisis in the US. So the US started putting a lot into space technology, research and development to be able to beat the Soviet Union. And probably you all know that the space race, which the contest was called, it ended in more or less in 1969, when NASA succeeded in actually putting a man on the moon. After NASA went to the moon, they built the Space Shuttle, which is the first actually reusable space plane ever built. It takes off vertically, and then it lands horizontally on a runway, like a normal plane. And the Space Shuttle went on to take over 350 astronauts to space. And it also helped building the International Space Station, which I'm sure you've all heard about. The International Space Station is one of the biggest and most complex engineering projects in the history of humankind. The Space Shuttle operated for 30 years before it retired in 2011. Here in Europe, we also have the European Space Agency, which was created in the 1960s as a collaboration of a lot of European countries to be able to make our own space program. Some of the biggest achievements of the European Space Agency is the Ariane 5 launcher, which is actually one of the most reliable rockets that is here today. It has since 2003, it has over 75 successful launches in a row, which is quite impressive. Maybe you've also heard about the Rosetta mission, which in 2014 became the first spacecraft to fly to a comet and actually land a lander on the comet, be able to characterize this whole comet and send pictures back to Earth, which is quite an impressive thing to do. So, I told you in the beginning that there is a new space revolution going on, right? And all of these things that I've told you about so far, they seem quite amazing, like they are very big achievements in space. So is there actually something bad about old space? Like, why do we need a new space revolution? Or why is there a new space revolution? Like, there is nothing bad in the missions that were created by the old space. But we are now at the turning point where we need something new and something that pushes us even further in space exploration. I'm going to tell you some things which are not so good with old space that we are trying to change today. So first of all, old space consists of these big, huge governmental agencies, or like big companies in aerospace that are working together with the government. And these big companies become quite slow and bureaucratic in the end. Like there are a lot person, and this process all becomes quite slow and bureaucratic and inefficient. And this leads to that there is not really a lot of innovation in the old space agencies. The space agencies also become quite risk averse. The money that they get a lot of it comes from the government, so the money is more or less secure, and then they become more risk averse. They don't want to take a lot of risks. Because they have created something that works, right? They created something that works, and why, if it works, then why should you change it? Like they are building the stuff the way that they always have built it, in a secure way that actually delivers on what the customer wants. So this makes them not take a lot of risks. And also, they didn't have to take a lot of risks. They didn't have to do things fast and take risks because there was no competition. Like there was one government agency that basically didn't have any competition in the private sector. Another thing is, it is kind of a theory of why space exploration or space missions become so expensive. Because the customer is typically a government or military, they put very, very high reliability demands on the spacecraft. Like they want it to work, right? And this leads that this makes the development costs very high for a space mission. If you have higher costs, there is only so much money for a couple of missions. So there become fewer missions. And if you have fewer missions, if you only have a couple of missions, you really, really want them to work, right? So that means that you put even higher reliability demands on the missions. And this becomes kind of a bad spiral in which the space missions become even more and more expensive. And the question is now, like, how are we gonna change this spiral? How are we gonna make, instead of space missions becoming more expensive and more expensive, how are we gonna make them cheaper and cheaper, right? So this is where the new space comes in. Like, how is the new space doing things differently than the old space used to do? The first thing is that we are now moving from traditional governmental agencies to a commercial space, where building satellites and rockets in private companies is getting more and more common. NASA in 2006, they opened this commercial space program, which means that they basically started funding private space companies to build rockets and satellites. So they kind of outsourced their technology and outsourced the building of the spacecraft to private companies. So this this private-public partnership made many private companies starting to build stuff in space because they got the money from NASA. And this led to, for example, SpaceX, I'm sure you've all heard about. In 2012, they became the first company, or the first private company, to actually build a spacecraft to dock with the International Space Station, which is quite a big achievement for a private company. Also, these partnerships, they open up ways for the commercial industry to actually themselves come up with new markets. For example, this is a picture from Virgin Galactic, who is building space planes to take tourists to space. Also, other markets open up, like, for example, taking high-resolution pictures of the Earth and selling them to companies here on Earth. And also, for example, as Facebook wants to do, to bring internet to all over the world. This is a new market that didn't exist before. There's also, like, in the beginning of this century, it was almost unthinkable for a company to start a business in space. Like, it was too expensive. And people, when Elon Musk started SpaceX, they were telling him that he was crazy, that he wouldn't have the money to build all these rockets that he wanted to build. But the success of companies such as SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, it inspires other entrepreneurs to actually start something or take the risk to start something in the space industry. And this all leads to now we're seeing kind of a startup community forming in the space industry, which is kind of a small Silicon Valley, but for space. You know, where the companies, they start to be agile, responsive, and accepting of risk instead of risk averse. I was just this last week at the conference in Europe, in Berlin, with my company, where there were over 50 startups just from Europe to present their ideas and to discuss their ideas about space and to get investors, which is also quite impressive. And there are people that say that there will be over 10,000 new space companies in the next couple of years. So the third point is miniaturization. Like, you know that the smartphone that you have in your pockets, it's over 1 million times better than, or more powerful than the computers that NASA used to launch to the moon, or to put a man on the moon. And this is quite impressive. Like, since weight is a big concern in space, it costs a lot of money to send just 1 kilogram of a satellite to space. This is quite amazing, because you can put all of this computational power in a very, very little space. And this leads to that people start building these smaller satellites, like you see in the picture. This is actually a company called Planet Labs that built these satellites and sent to space. And now they have over 144 satellites in orbit, and they have only been around for 7 years. In 7 years, they have built 144 satellites. And these satellites, they help Planet Labs to monitor the whole Earth every day. So they get high-resolution pictures of the whole Earth every day. Another thing that the NewSpace companies do is that they streamline the processes. They are taking kind of a Silicon Valley approach to doing spacecraft. SpaceX, for example, they didn't have time, or Elon Musk didn't think that they had time to wait for someone else, for another company to build parts for them. So he said, okay, we'll do everything in-house. And this makes the process much faster, and the rockets that they build much cheaper. And another way you can do that is to take advantage of new technologies such as 3D printing in actually making rockets. This is an engine that is completely 3D printed from a company called Aerojet Rocketdyne that they are testing now. And 3D printing rockets is going to make them much cheaper. They have fewer parts, and it's going to take much, much less time to develop them. So the fifth thing is reusability. Like old space, they already had reusability. There was a space shuttle, right? It was a space plane that could actually land, and then after some maintenance, it could fly again. The problem is that the time it took to do the maintenance was much, much higher than what NASA had ever expected. Like in the beginning, they had envisioned that the space shuttle would launch like every week or every couple of weeks. But the process of doing the maintenance when it came back, it took months and was much, much more expensive than what they ever had imagined. So the space shuttle in the end was a good idea, but it became very, very expensive. And companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, they invest a lot of money in reusability because they think that this is the one key point into lowering the cost of the launches. And this lowering the cost of the launches means that you can make more launches and you can send more satellites into space. Okay, so where does all this lead? Even before old space, even before we started sending stuff into space, we have always dreamed about going further than Earth, going to Mars, making settlements on the moon, etc. And old space, it took us to the moon. But the truth is that we haven't been back since the 70s. Like, we haven't been back and we haven't gone further than the moon. So I think that new space and the new way of thinking about space is actually going to help us to go further than that. But I also think that new space, it cannot completely replace the old space, because the old space is very important for these missions like exploration missions and scientific missions that don't give a profit, that don't give a return of your money, so that the new space companies, they don't want to do it. But the new space, like, by making these satellites and rockets cheaper, it's going to enable the space agencies to focus on the science missions instead. And I think that only the collaboration between new space and old space players will make us get further than we are today, and make us go to Mars, for example. And I want to end my talk with a quote from an American computer scientist, which name was Grace Hopper. And this is something that you can all maybe think about if you're students, and if you're going into an industry that hasn't changed a lot. And she said that the most damaging phrase in the language is "it's always been done that way." Thank you.